You may know Ernest Orlando Lawrence from his fame as an experimental physicist, the inventor of the cyclotron, a Nobel laureate, his work on the Manhattan Project, his famous friendship, or perhaps his even more famous falling out with J. Robert Oppenheimer. But did you know he also had a hand in the creation of color TV? Before I get to that story, I want to mention that this video is part of a new series put out by IEEE Spectrum. We are partnering with Asianometry to give multiple perspectives on a single story, in this case, the histories of color television. I will point you to the other videos later, so be on the lookout for that. Now, back to our famous physicist, E.O. Lawrence. Lawrence had actually dabbled in black and white TV when he was a young scholar at Yale, but Philo Farnsworth was making more significant inroads in television, so Lawrence left it behind for bigger things when he headed to Berkeley. More than 20 years later, after his many successes, remember the cyclotron, Nobel Prize, and Manhattan Project, Lawrence had yet to slow down. He was busy running his radiation laboratory, or rad lab. The machinery had grown so large that in 1940 it relocated to its present site on top of a hill overlooking the Berkeley campus. It is known today as the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. But post-World War II, Lawrence was overworked and chronically ill, with recurring pneumonia, ulcerative colitis, and a host of other ailments. Doctors ordered him to relax, maybe find a hobby. Lawrence's interpretation of this prescription? Start a separate electronics lab in his garage to tinker with a side project. He dived back into the world of television, but this time in color.
First, I'd like to say this, that I feel
In 1948, Lawrence surveyed the state of the field. The Radio Corporation of America, or RCA as we know it today, already had several patents for color television technology. The Columbia Broadcasting System, or CBS, was one of the largest radio networks in the United States and had started their television programming in 1941. Color was the obvious next step. And George Sleeper, the chief engineer for a company called, as you might expect, Color Television, was working diligently to create a unified standard for color TV. Lawrence was entering a crowded field. Television can be broken down into three basic components: the camera that records the image, the transmitter that sends the signal via radio waves, and the receiver that turns those signals back into a picture. In 1927, Philo Farnsworth had a complete working television system, but it could only handle black and white. Color was much more complicated because instead of recording, sending, and recombining one signal, it used three signals, one for red, one for green, and one for blue. These three colors are the most effective additive system for creating color screen. Of course, like most engineering problems, there was not a single correct solution on how to record, transmit, and recombine the signal. Each of the major players researching color TV were approaching the problem from a different perspective with a predictable outcome: a total lack of compatibility. A nightmare for both television studios eager to film in color and consumers who wanted to be able to watch all shows available on their televisions. In 1949, Lawrence and his friend and fellow physicist from the Manhattan Project, Luis Alvarez, saw a demonstration of Sleeper's color TV tube. The picture was a blurry mess. Alvarez didn't even believe it was real without running his own tests. But Lawrence's tinkering heart was excited. This is something he could improve. Within a few months of embarking on this new enterprise, Lawrence had rigged up an experimental apparatus. He knew that there was value in the project, and he tasked two men from his lab to build a working prototype based on his design. Rowan Gaither, a San Francisco lawyer who had his hands in lots of big government contracts, had more faith in the project than Lawrence's doubting friends. Specifically, he thought there might be some commercial value in color television. And so he proposed a partnership. On the 31st of March, 1950, Chromatic Television Laboratories was born. Gaither had the Hollywood connections, and soon Paramount Pictures was one of their major financial investors. At the time, Lawrence had a vacation bungalow in Diablo, California, about an hour from Berkeley and halfway to what would become a new branch of the radiation laboratory in Livermore. There, in his garage, Lawrence set up a lab space and electronics shop for experimenting with color television. Perhaps presaging a Google campus lifestyle, the garage had a ping-pong table and a beer-stocked refrigerator. Who says you can't have a little fun while doing some serious physics? He added bunk beds for anyone who needed to sleep over, and Lawrence recruited some of the top minds from the Rad Lab to get to work on tube design. Around the same time, the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, started working on a single national standard for color television, which is such an interesting story in its own right that I have a whole other video on that topic. Getting back to Lawrence and his cathode ray tube design, one of the more unique aspects of his approach was that he and his team of Rad Lab physicists focused on a single electron gun, while others were testing out a 3-gun approach, 1 electron gun for each color. Although, to be fair, Lawrence also experimented with the 3-gun approach before settling on his more elegant design. Lawrence's single gun shot a focused stream of electrons onto the viewing plate, which was coated in very fine lines of phosphorus. He had high hopes for this design, but its first demonstration was a complete and utter failure. He couldn't get the beam to focus, but Lawrence was undeterred. Back to the drawing board. RCA was having the same problem. They placed what was called a shadow mask, or a shadow screen, behind the image plate. It helped focus the image, but it also absorbed most of the color. Lawrence, instead, decided to borrow a technique Alvarez had developed with his linear accelerator. When Alvarez needed to focus his electron beam, he inserted a grid of wires. Lawrence took the idea and inserted a carefully woven mesh of wires. In fact, 450 sets of red, green, and blue color-tuned wires in front of the image plate. The result was an astonishingly focused picture with bright colors. He christened it the Chromatron, a nod to his more famous invention, the cyclotron. If you would like to know more about the technical details of the design, I strongly suggest Robert Dressler's article in the July 1953 issue of the Proceedings of the IRE, that is, the Institute of Radio Engineers. Dressler was the director of R&D at the New York Laboratory of Chromatic Television, and the IRE was one of the predecessor organizations of the IEEE, which is hosting this video. Paramount was excited. It seemed like a great success. They ponied up more money and pushed to move to production. But this was an experimental success, not a manufacturing one. The wire mesh was painstakingly hand-woven. This is not something that could scale easily. Lawrence had to figure out how to simplify manufacturing, and the stress was beginning to get to him. During the spring of 1952, Lawrence's health deteriorated to the point where he was hospitalized. This time, he really did have to take a break from work, not this stressful so-called distraction of developing an entirely new consumer product. And what a break it was. His friends organized an all-round-the-world voyage for him, his wife, one of his daughters, and their family doctor. The primary method of transportation, VIP suites on tankers owned by Standard Oil. Along the way, they stopped at film locations and hobnobbed with movie stars as the guests of Paramount Pictures. Truly not a bad way to travel. For 2 months at the beginning of 1953, it seemed like Lawrence was actually relaxed. Things were looking up. During the trip, Lawrence had a hand in another milestone in television broadcasting. On June 2, 1953, an estimated 27 million people in Britain tuned in to see the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II live as it happened. More than 100 million people watched the rebroadcast in Canada, the United States, and elsewhere. It was a technical achievement simply from the standpoint of the rigging of cameras and microphones along the parade route and inside Westminster Abbey, plus the coordinated commentary explaining what was going on. But there was more. Almost everyone viewed the ceremony in black and white, except for approximately 150 to 200 children and staff at the Great Ormond Street Hospital in London. They witnessed the street procession in brilliant color on 2 20-inch Lawrence Chromatron tube televisions. Pi Limited, an electronics shop in Cambridge, had set up 3 color recording cameras overlooking Parliament Square. The program was transmitted over the air by a low-power, wide-band UHF transmitter to a closed-circuit TV system within the hospital. This is considered to be the first outside color television broadcast ever attempted. Once again, it seemed like color TV was on the cusp of greatness. But unfortunately, it was not so. Economics were proving difficult to master. This type of production rate and cost control was a big change from Lawrence's time on government contracts, where he was only making 1 or 2 perfect specimens with a seemingly limitless wartime budget. Paramount wanted Chromatic to make color television tubes quickly and cheaply at a nominal cost of no more than $50 to $75 each, which is $600 to $880 in today's pricing. The retail price point would be about $500, or just under $6,000 today. Clearly, still a luxury good. Richard Hodgson, president of Chromatic and the former director of television at Paramount, acknowledged problems with production, saying 1 out of 20 tubes might be satisfactory, and the others would implode. Every year, the commercial potential of color television seemed tantalizingly close, but just out of reach. No manufacturers, neither Lawrence nor his competitors, were making any headway with production. But, perhaps more importantly, consumers too seemed to be losing interest in the possibility. Meanwhile, there were other big questions for physicists to grapple with, such as hydrogen bombs and bubble chambers. Did all these specialist PhDs want to continue tinkering with a losing technology? The torch was passed to scientists in Japan, the only other country that was seriously experimenting with color television. In 1961, the founders of Sony Corporation witnessed a demonstration of the Chromatron in New York, and they thought that they could improve it, and they did. Although it brought them to the brink of bankruptcy, Sony managed to bring the first successful color television to market, the Trinitron, the name a nod to Lawrence Chromatron. To hear the dramatic conclusion of this story, head on over to the YouTube channel Asianometry, where my friend John will describe the incredible gyrations Sony went through to turn the Chromatron into a commercially successful product. So what happened when Oppenheimer's former bestie took a break from physics to invent color TV? It was a curious, slow-rolling disaster with much hype and little success. Chromatic television employed 3 Nobel laureates and had the backing of a major Hollywood studio, yet it managed to fail dramatically. That's actually more often than not how science goes. Despite what Hollywood likes to tell us, rarely is the invention of anything an epiphany in a garage where the lone genius and a few of his buddies manage to make something magical. The more accurate, if duller story is about many failed attempts and false starts and lots of money before something finally takes hold. Eventually it does. But the story's not over. Head over to Asianometry or check out my other video on TV standards. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below.